Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Jessica Collins. I'm one of the associate trauma trainers here at Epione Training and Consultancy. And today I'll be going over the window of tolerance. So, what it is, and why this model is so relevant for us in the work that we do with clients who've experienced trauma, and also how we can use our understanding of window of tolerance to help us engage with practical strategies to support people's regulation and their sense of emotional safety. I suppose the window of tolerance is a framework that really helps us to understand what's happening in the nervous system and think about how we can help people who've experienced trauma moving from that place of being in survival mode due to the difficult experiences that they've had into a place where they can think, feel, and connect with others. And of course, we know that when people are able to connect with others, it's that connection with others where people can begin to heal from trauma. So I hope this framework can be really helpful for people to understand. So what is the window of tolerance? This is a model that was developed by Dr. Dan Siegel, and it describes the window itself describes the person's optimal zone of arousal. So it's a state of regulation within the mind and body where a person can function at their best. So when someone is within their window, they can handle stress, they can engage with other people, they can think relatively clearly, and they can feel their emotions without becoming overwhelmed. So, we can feel negative emotions within our window of tolerance, and particularly in response to challenges and stresses within our life, but we don't necessarily become overwhelmed by those emotions. And this optimal zone of arousal is depicted by this middle section where the window is, where depicted by a happy little sun in the diagram on screen. When a person goes outside of their window of tolerance, they will either tip into hyperarousal, and this is essentially a person's fight or flight response. The person might feel overwhelmed by their emotions and begin to feel really difficult emotions like being highly anxious, angry and rage type emotions, really panicky or highly distressed in some way. Often these emotions can feel quite hot emotions, which is why this is depicted as a fire in the diagram on screen. Other people might, when they go outside of their window of tolerance, they might move into hypoarousal. So that's the bit at the bottom of the screen here. This is essentially a person's freeze or shut down response. So within hypoarousal, the person might feel really flat, numb, disconnected. They might appear really kind of spaced out or extremely low in energy, so quite lethargic. Later on, we'll look a bit further into what the hyper and hypoarousal zones look like in a little bit more detail. And I guess what's important is everybody's window of tolerance is different. Some people's window of tolerance might be quite wide, others might be quite narrow. And we all move up and down within our window of tolerance throughout the day. So just like the yellow line on the image there, that's like a picture of somebody moving up and down throughout their window of tolerance. So experiencing lots of different emotions throughout the day, but all of that feeling manageable within their window of tolerance. And lots of factors can affect our window of tolerance from day to day. So things like hormonal changes, if you're experiencing pain or you're particularly unwell, that might narrow your window of tolerance temporarily. Tiredness, among lots of other factors that can change how wide our window of tolerance is each day. But for those with a trauma history, especially those with developmental or complex trauma, their window of tolerance is often narrower, kind of overall, is a narrow window of tolerance, which of course means that they move out of their window of tolerance more easily. So even facing the same challenges or stresses as other people, it's more likely to then tip them outside of their window of tolerance. So to kind of think about this in a little more detail, let's start with a relatable clinical example. Let's say, imagine someone named Sarah. She wakes up, she makes a coffee, and she's getting on with her day. She starts her day within her window of tolerance. She's on her way to work, she hits some traffic, and that's really irritating. I'm sure we can all relate to that experience of hitting traffic on the way to work, and you feel really irritated, but it's manageable. So you're experiencing a difficult emotion, but it's still within your window of tolerance. But then someone cuts her off suddenly on the motorway, and they nearly have an accident. Her heart starts to race. She feels her chest tightening. Her thoughts are racing. She's really panicking. She thinks something really scary or dangerous is going to happen. Sarah might then flip into hyperarousal. That's what she's experiencing there throughout her body and her mind. In response to that, she might yell, she might start to feel really shaky and really edgy for a while, she might start to feel really unsafe. She might pull over and take some time to do some deep breathing and wait for herself to calm down so that she can feel safe enough to continue her journey to work. Let's say that she gets into work, has quite a stressful long work day, and then when she gets home, she completely crashes. Here we can see some examples of hypoarousal for Sarah. So, for example, she starts to feel distant and disconnected from her partner. She doesn't want to talk to anyone. She cancels going out for a walk with her best friend. She can't even focus on the TV that they're watching together. She's not even watching that because that would require her brain to be a bit online, and she's feeling totally shut down. Instead, she's just scrolling on her phone for hours, not really engaging in anything and feeling really flat. Might be, though, that for Sarah, after some time, she realizes that she's not feeling great. She needs some self-care and that she's had a really difficult day and needs to soothe her nervous system. So she decides to take a hot bath with some of her favorite music in the background, and she manages to soothe herself and return to her window of tolerance before the end of the day. So I guess what this example tells us is that even without experiencing a traumatic history, any of us can move outside of our window depending on the challenges and triggers that we encounter. What's important is that many people have learned skills to self-regulate their emotions, so to be able to return to their window of tolerance relatively quickly, within a relatively quick time frame. Let's have a think about what happens then for people who have experienced trauma. So when we have trauma in the picture, as we said, somebody with who's experienced trauma will have a more narrow window of tolerance, especially those who've had kind of complex interpersonal relational trauma in their early years. They might not have had the opportunities to learn to widen their window of tolerance, because that's how we develop a wider window of tolerance, is through connection with adults in our earlier years, where our adults, if we're experiencing a difficult emotion as a child, an adult will help soothe and regulate and co-regulate those emotions with us. And that's how we learn to tolerate and manage and regulate our emotions. So those who've had extremely difficult early lives are unlikely to have had the same opportunities to learn to widen their window of tolerance and learn strategies for regulating. So as you can see on the diagram, it's like their window of tolerance remains a bit narrower. And then due to their difficult experiences of encountering threat, their nervous system is switched on to high alert. So their nervous system has learned to adapt to look for threats, so to be scanning for threats in the environment. And what this means is that everyday stressors, like interactions with other people, coming across loud noises, receiving feedback at work or school, or just from our friends in our personal lives, or even something like a facial expression of a stranger that they walk past on the street, all of these everyday experiences can be sort of felt as stressors and can push people outside of their window of tolerance very quickly. So in hyperarousal, that we can see at the top here, you might see people appear to be, or they tell you that they're feeling really anxious, panicky, or just kind of this perpetual feeling of being unsafe, feeling unsafe when they're in hyperarousal. People might present as highly irritable or angry to a degree that feels disproportionate to the context. Of course, sometimes people feel angry, and that's a very valid emotion. It's valid to feel these emotions, but there's this sense that they've been pushed to the extreme of anger due to experiencing a stressor. People might appear quite restless or pacing. There's kind of a fastness or an urgency to their movements and their presence. So they might be really fast in their speech. They might be breathing really rapidly. Everything that, again, feels really fast and urgent, disproportionate to the context that the person is in. They might experience difficulty concentrating, because we know that the brain, our concentrating, thinking brain, kind of goes offline when we're in a fight or flight mode. So they might not be able to concentrate. Say if you're in a session, you might notice that they're not able to engage in the content of the session in the same way because their emotions are extremely high. And we might see some impulsive behaviours, or behaviours where people are struggling to engage in social interactions. So perhaps you might notice them lashing out at you or at other people, not being able to tolerate the session in the way that they might have done before, and having to leave the session, or just shutting down from conversations. So they might remain in the session, but you notice that they're not able to engage and shut down the conversations. And remember that when someone is in hyperarousal, that's because their nervous system has recognized a trigger which might remind the person of a threat from their previous experiences. And their nervous system and body is saying to them, I am not safe, I have to act. And what you're seeing is their body and nervous system trying to engage a fight or flight response to keep them safe. In hypoarousal, we might see this general sense of really flat in affect, so kind of maybe emotionless, low in energy, but like kind of extremely low in energy, kind of lethargic, slowed in their functioning. People might report a degree of numbness, or you might notice that. So they might be telling you about some really difficult experience, but it's kind of like their emotions aren't matching what they're telling you. It feels like they're just really numb or emotionally kind of blunted. We might notice people um, feeling like they're not particularly present in the room with us. So either they're entirely dissociated from us or a sense that they've zoned out from the room. You might notice some blank stares. It feels like they're not really looking at you. They're kind of looking through you or past you because they're not truly present in the room or in the moment. People's responses might be delayed, so it kind of feels like it's taken them a long time to respond to you, or the amount of response that you get is really minimal, so quite minimal speech or speech that doesn't feel like is truly responding to the question that you've asked. You might notice people having difficulty remembering previous conversations because their brain isn't online in the way that it might usually be, their cortex isn't online, or that they're struggling to process the conversation that you're having with them. So you feel like they're struggling to keep up or remain on track with the discussion that you're having. And I guess in general, people who are within hypoarousal will present as withdrawn, struggling to get engaged with others, struggling to engage in the things that they need to do, like work or household tasks, or even the things that they enjoy. It's probably going to be difficult for them to engage in the same way. And people might describe feelings of hopelessness when they're in hypoarousal as well. And I guess when somebody's in hypoarousal, this is their nervous system shutting down to survive. So it's really important that we don't see this as a lack of motivation or a lack of engagement in sessions, but instead it's a protective response that the person is withdrawing and shutting down from potential threats. Often people have experienced interpersonal trauma with others who are meant to care for them. So if we present ourselves as somebody who's trying to help and support, it might be that for them that's quite a triggering situation to be expected to engage with a new person who's offering support and help. So their nervous system is telling them to shut down and protect themselves from that. And that's just something for us to be mindful of when we're trying to engage people in work with us. And people who have experienced traumas are often faced with situations that remind them of their past, known as triggers. I'm sure lots of us will have come across this concept of triggers before. Triggers can push people either to the edge of their window or entirely outside of their window of tolerance and activate the nervous system survival response. Because the nervous system is recognizing even a vague similarity to their traumatic experiencing and initiating a survival response based on this feels like in the past. So I'd rather be safe than sorry. I'd rather initiate a survival response and survive this threat than not respond and risk being harmed again. And I suppose our work with clients should aim to help them build awareness and understanding of their window of tolerance. So, what they look like when they're in each zone of arousal, and also what their triggers are that push them either towards the edge of their window of tolerance or outside of their window of tolerance entirely. So, sometimes this process is called naming and taming triggers. There's the idea that there's this power in naming what's happening to us as a first step towards regulation. I suppose the reason why naming can be so helpful and help us in our kind of journey to taming our triggers is when we name an emotion, a bodily response, a trigger, a thought, anything. When we name it, it instantly creates a space between us, our experience, and the thing that we're noticing. So, for example, the act of naming, I notice that I'm feeling panicky when somebody raises their voice, can shift the person just slightly from being in that panicky place and feeling consumed by panic and consumed by emotions into a place of observing that I feel panic and observing that I'm noticing that there's a trigger that's causing me to feel panic. And this degree of space gives the client the chance to choose a different response, or at least just to choose an opportunity, to find an opportunity to regulate their emotions. So I guess by doing this work with clients, what this often means is building their capacity to notice and name their physiological states and their emotional states. So to notice their zone of their optimal zone of arousal, to notice what hyper and hypo arousal looks like for them, identify their triggers, which can be subtle ones. So for some people, it's really concrete things like somebody who looks like somebody who did something to me, who harmed me, or a smell or a place, or something that's very clear and concrete. Sometimes it's not so obvious. It can feel subtle. So it can be a sense of being ignored or rejected by others. So, for example, a child in a classroom who just doesn't feel that they belong with others, even if they haven't been directly harmed or rejected, but they just don't feel that they fit. And that in itself can be a trigger for people. So by being able to notice those states that we have and identify the triggers that move us in and out of those emotional states, we can then help people to build an awareness to apply regulation strategies with our support. And a little later, I'll go into some examples of what regulation strategies might look like for people when we're helping them understand their window of tolerance. And of course, we're not asking people to avoid their triggers. We're not doing this work so that we can name triggers and avoid them, because unfortunately, people are going to come across really challenging situations and stresses within their daily life. We want people to be able to engage in their daily life where you might come across things that are challenging, but we want to be able to help people to recognize triggers sooner and use naming and taming and other regulation strategies to stay connected and psychologically safe, to communicate to our nervous system that I know you feel under threat, but we are safe. The other thing this work can do, which is really nice, is provide the client a language to share their experience with others. So often we know that people who've experienced trauma, who have a bit of a different emotional experience from those around them, like others find it really difficult to understand, what the triggers are. And for other people, I'll often hear from parents and teachers that it came out of nowhere, nothing happened, and all of a sudden they went from 0 to 100. But actually, by doing this work with people, we can help the person and those around them understand that there was a trigger there that was felt by the person, and what their emotional experience was, why they apparently went from 0 to 100. And this gives the person a method of communication to help the people around them understand them, but also to elicit the support that they need from others in terms of co-regulation, or simply just some space for them to engage in regulation strategies. So how do we help someone to get back into their window of tolerance once they've experienced a trigger? This is where our regulation strategies come in. And we can use these to either slow things down when someone is in hyperarousal, or speed things up when someone's in hypoarousal. And I've shared the slide here, which has loads of different examples. Feel free to pause the video and have a good read of all the examples we have on screen. What we know is there's loads of resources, videos, clips, all sorts of things out there where people have excellent regulation strategies that they use with clients. And of course, we know this is very individual. So I've had clients where for some clients a particular strategy works really well, for others they really hate it. It just doesn't work for them. So it's very much about a case-by-case basis, finding what works for you as a practitioner and for your individual clients. But I'll go through some sort of key examples that you might want to consider. In terms of slowing down, so when someone is in hyperarousal, remember they're in a fight or flight mode. So their heart's racing, their thoughts are spiraling, they're full of anxiety, energy, rage, panic, and their system needs to slow down. So what we need is to be able to communicate to their nervous system a cue of safety, to tell them that, thank you, nervous system, I know that you're trying to keep me safe by initiating a fight or flight response, but it's okay, we're safe now. So some of the strategies that we might use to help slow people down is by deep, slow breathing. What we know about this is that almost provides a bit of feedback to our nervous system, that almost this idea that if I'm breathing slowly, I'm telling you, nervous system, that we're fine. If I was running away from a tiger, I wouldn't be doing deep, slow breathing. I'd be doing really fast, rapid breathing to run away. So if we tell our system that we're safe by using slow breathing, that can be really helpful. There's lots of different breathing strategies out there that you can support clients to use. Using the sensory world is really helpful. So asking people to ground through their senses. So noticing senses within the room. So, notice 4 items that are the colour green, or notice 4 things that you can hear, or 5 things that you can see. You know, these things that kind of reorient the person to the room that they're in the present moment, or actively engaging the senses in things that the person finds calming and soothing to slow them down. You know, things like certain scents that it might be a calming scent like lavender or something like that, or it might be a scent of their a loved one's perfume, or you know, something like that that they find really soothing, which can be really helpful, or calming music, that sort of stuff. And soothing rhythms, like soothing rhythmic movements can be really helpful. Things like slow walking, like as much as it feels really basic, like if you tried to go for a walk, it feels really basic, but there's a scientific basis in that having a slow rhythmic movement really helps to just slow the nervous system down. And again, it communicates a sense of safety to your nervous system that I'm doing a slow walk, we're fine and we're safe. Um, can also help with slow swaying or slow kind of bilateral tapping. Can again just tell the nervous system that we're safe and we're okay. And then in terms of speeding up strategies, so remember when someone's in hypoarousal, they're feeling disconnected, numb, foggy, they're in a kind of freeze or shutdown response. And what we need to do here is just gently reactivate the nervous system. Of course, we don't want to overwhelm the nervous system. If someone is in a freeze or shutdown response and we try to reactivate them too quickly, it's unlikely to be that successful. But we're just asking the nervous system to bring some energy back into the body and come back online. So again, movement can be really helpful, but movement that's relatively energizing. So maybe stretching the body and feeling how nice it feels to stretch out. A bit of gentle bouncing or dancing can be really nice. To kind of wake up the body, or walking along to some music. Again, it should be music because we're trying to speed up. It should be music that's quite active and energetic and bouncy to help people kind of bring some energy back. Again, the sensory world is very helpful. So activating scents, things like citrus, or really activating tastes like a really strong mint or a really sour sweet can really bring some energy back into the body. Sometimes cold water can be helpful, but again, we don't want any of these experiences to be too distressing or uncomfortable, just enough to wake the body back up. And of course, reorienting the person to the present moment. So if they're able to engage in this, asking them to come back into the room, you know, can you feel your feet on the ground right now? Can you feel yourself sat in the chair? What do you notice in the room? So again, it just regrounds them in the present moment. And I suppose we're wanting them over time to support them to name that shutdown state. So you're noticing it's hard to stay present. You might feel that your nervous system is trying to protect you from going quiet and shutting down. What can we do to help speed your nervous system up again? So some of this language around your nervous system can be quite helpful to get people thinking in a different way. So in summary, the window of tolerance is a really helpful way to understand how people respond to stress. I hope this has been a helpful video to capture some of the basics of that. We know that trauma often narrows that window of tolerance for people, making them more vulnerable to becoming dysregulated, so tipping into hyper or hypoarousal. But through this work, we can support people to understand their window of tolerance, to name and tame their triggers, and use regulation tools to return to their window of tolerance. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video has given you a clear and a kind of practical understanding of the window of tolerance and how you can use it in your work.